the character was a lot darker. I was also dealing with the fact that she was a woman and trying to exist in a very physical time, a very brutal time, where she was pretty much at the mercy of some dubious characters, and the things that she had to do to survive in some cases were quite ingenious, in other cases were just very, very savage. So she's quite a complex character in that respect.
That was the voice of Brian O'Sullivan, a New Zealand-based novelist of Iron Age Ireland. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome to our latest Global Irish Nation conversation here on Irish Stew. This episode is sponsored by Shantala, your all-in-one business launchpad in the United States. Committed to excellence and execution, Shantala helps enterprises enter or expand in the U.S. market through bespoke project management and strategic planning solutions. Create and realize your vision with Shantala, where they invest their passion in your future success. To learn more, go to shantala.space. Yes, .space. It's a thing. Hey, back on Irish Stew here. And, Martin, I think it's only natural that a lot of our guests are based in Ireland. And the fact that both of us live in New York City, we've had quite a few guests from the New York City area. But we're always looking to expand that global Irish guest roster. And we're going to take Irish Stew about as far afield as we've ever gone. Where are we going next?
Yeah, so our next guest takes us over to the other side of the world, New Zealand specifically, and while that might seem like a long way from Ireland, our guest is devoted to making Irish mythology and culture accessible to a global audience in a more accurate and entertaining way. He is author of a number of book series which focus on Iron Age Ireland. Specifically, he has taken some of the most famous Irish myths and reimagined the nature of Ireland at that time, featuring the stories of both Fionn, Liath Luachra, and other stories of Ireland's deep past. With that, I'd like to welcome Brian O'Sullivan to Irish Stew. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much for having me.
And good morning to you, Brian. It's evening for us the day before.
Yes.
So we're going to kick it off this way, Brian. After reading some of your books, I get the sense that the past is very present for you. Now, that's a supposition, but is there a place in Ireland that makes it even more so?
I guess Ireland has such a long history with it that it's kind of impossible to look at the present without understanding some of the past. That's a bit of a cliche, of course, but really you can't have a real sort of sense of where you are if you don't understand the context of how you got there in the first place. And with history and sort of cultural belief systems and so on like that, it really does. If you get your head around that, it actually gives you a sort of a much better perspective on where you are and where you potentially could go in the future.
So do you have any particular site a favorite site in Ireland that you visit or go back to?
Yes, I mean, all my family are kind of from West Cork, or rather a large section of them are. So I'm very much linked to the Beara Peninsula. Mm-hmm. And there's a term that they use basically in Marydom. They say it's the place where you stand, even though you might not be living there. It's more the concept of home, but home related to a sense of connection in terms of both whakapapa, which is genealogy, but also emotional connection. So for me, Beara is very much not just because I've got bones in the ground there going way back, but I've also got a huge sort of emotional connection to it from having sort of grown up there quite a lot as a kid.
So tell us, Irish is a language that you overtly, actively use in your books. So tell us about the meaning of the name O'Sullivan.
Sullivan. It's well, yeah. I mean, a lot of Irish names. Anyway, first thing to say is a lot of Irish names have been anglicized, so the actual meaning has been taken away from them. Of Sullivan, it comes from the Ogonaíocht, who were based sort of central Ireland, up around sort of Musgreen, around Cashel. And one sort of sub branch of that particular grouping were the Osulawan. There's numerous theories as to where the actual name comes from. One of the sort of the more amusing is that it comes from the word Sul-Owan, as in one eye, which it's just not the case.
That'd be too easy.
Yes, I can see clearly. I can see clearly now. But it all depends. There's a lot of different sort of derivations given to it. A lot of that stuff is so old that it's kind of hard to actually work out. I can't honestly remember the last time I read the background on that. But when they came down, the Osulawan sort of split into the Osulawan Moor and Osulawan Vera. And the Osulawan Vera were mostly based around the Beara Peninsula. Osulawan were predominantly around the sort of the Kerry side of that peninsula.
Well, Brian, let's go to the Beara Peninsula and hear a little bit more about your origin. We really don't know too much about you yet. We couldn't find, we don't have your resume. Tell us a little bit about how you grew up and how it was so imprinted on you that you're kind of in a way you're living there right now today.
Yeah, I intentionally kind of keep my profile low in terms of media. I don't put my photograph out anywhere, and I'm a pretty private person in any case. I grew up in Cork. My dad was an O'Sullivan from Beara, and of course the saying down in Beara is you throw a stone in the bush, you'll hit an O'Sullivan. It's basically the whole peninsula. You're either Harrington, O'Sullivan, and a few Murphys as well too, predominantly. You walk through Castletownbere, you'll just see all those names predominantly on all of the shop fronts there. And so I was very lucky in that even though we were based in Cork City, my dad used to bring us down to West Cork pretty much every weekend. And sometimes we'd stay down there for the sort of summer holidays as well. We were particularly lucky in that we were kind of brought up in, we had a sort of a house down by the sea, and there was really nobody around at that stage. And we had a bit of an idyllic lifestyle in that we would just head out in the mornings and sort of come back whenever we felt like it later in the day. It's a sort of a sense of freedom I don't think our own kids have ever kind of experienced.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of my Dublin childhood in a way, and I think the stuff that we used to do as children. We live in an era now where it feels like everybody needs to feel for constant connection. And, literally, as a child, I was out and about for hours on end with my mother, having no idea where I was or what I was doing. I think something has been lost a little bit, in that. I also noticed I came across a blog posting where you kind of told a story about Ballinasspittle, which is an interesting place just north of Cumhaill. I remember it well from 1985. It was the place of the weeping statues or moving statues in Ballinasspittle, and apparently you were down in Cumhaill right when that happened, and family used to do a bit of sailing, I think, from what I could tell. But talk to us about sailing and those statues, and how does that fit into Irish mythology?
Again, I was lucky to sort of spend my sort of late teen years down in Cumhaill, where I did do quite a lot of sailing. Again, I had that freedom of being able to take the boat out and just disappearing for most of the day, or and coming back. For a long time, I was actually living on my dad's boat on the marina in Cumhaill. So I'd spend summers down there living on that particular boat, and pretty much sailing on my own sort of very small boat during the day. The whole Ballinasspittle thing was quite a period in Ireland where you had the moving statues. I think it was the 80s, but it started off in Ballinasspittle, where there was two women passing one of the sort of the statues, the holy statues out there, happened to notice that it was moving. Or not quite sure in what detail, but it turned up on the news probably the next day or so on. The next day after that, there was probably about 50 or 60 people there. And again, most of them were sort of swearing it was moving. So within a very short period of time, you had hundreds of people turning up there every day, praying and so on. And there was something I'd never seen in Cumhaill was a double-decker bus had actually come down from Cork. There was literally so many people coming down. Ballinasspittle is probably about 15-20 minute drive from Cumhaill. So we never actually bothered going there because it was too close. So it was always something you'd sort of do the next day, when you weren't so busy. But Ireland kind of went through this kind of hysteria at the time. The moving statues spread throughout the country, and it was on the news literally every night. There was another statue was moving or doing something, and I do remember seeing this interview with this kid, and he was saying that there was like angels flying around the sky, and it was really hysterical kind of stuff, which is, I think the word hysteria, kind of a religious hysteria, had sort of just swept the country. It then all came to kind of a sudden close when some guy attacked it with a hammer, and to prove a point, he went in and he actually smashed up the statue. And even though they tried to repair it after that, it never really moved that much again, and suddenly everybody didn't want to talk about it anymore, and everybody was a little bit embarrassed by the whole thing. It was a fascinating period we kind of lived through, that sort of very intense sort of few months over that one summer.
It's an interesting, and of course, I remember Christy Moore lampooning it.
That's right. Yeah, he's one of many. It became a
song,
kind of a
was it Delirium
stereotype.
Tremens?
That's right.
I think
it was written up quite a bit in Fintan O'Toole's book, that Martin, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
Yep. That's how I'm familiar with it.
Yeah. Ourselves Alone. Yeah.
Yep.
What was it? I'm blanking on the book name.
Yep.
I think it kind of marked a sort of a period, because it was only a few years later that Father Ted started coming out, and you had this kind of it marked a kind of a changing point, I think, in sort of Irish culture, and where you had the very sort of conservative religious stuff, and then you had this kind of rejection of it all in terms of lampooning, comedy, and so on. And that kind of balanced spittle period sort of was the peak of one leading into the other, in a sense.
Brian, you're a writer. I'd be interested to hear about some of the other interests of your life. For instance, in academia, what grabbed you? Did academia grab you at all? Did education have a particular meaning for you?
I was educated, I suppose. I went to University College Cork, where I actually studied microbiology. I'm actually a microbiologist by profession, even though I haven't actually done anything to do with bugs for well over 30 years or so. In Ireland, at that time, during the sort of the 80s, early 90s, there was a huge number of people passing through Irish universities, and of course there was no work for them. So as soon as you came out of university, you basically had to emigrate unless you wanted to sort of work, unless you were lucky enough to get something in Ireland. So I was kind of one in that wave of people who got the degree, and sort of the next day I was off overseas. Particularly in when you had a science degree as well, too, about 80% of people who do science degrees never actually end up in science. They end up in completely different industries. And that was pretty much the case for me. So I left Ireland straight afterwards. I went over to London, where I was living with a bunch of Irish guys for a few months. Then I ended up in Birmingham, where I probably worked for about a year, and really did not enjoy my time in Birmingham. So at that stage, I'd met a French woman who I was living with, and we moved to France. And then I ended up staying in France probably for about 4 years. So after that, I ended up in New Zealand. So I've pretty much been following women around the world. Essentially, I've been kind of led by the nose. So my partner is a Maori woman who I met in France at a party, and we had a kind of a long distance relationship for a while, and eventually ended up coming to New Zealand. And that was actually by accident, because we were trying to get into Australia, but it just proved easier to get into New Zealand at the time.
Brian, we always talk about, kind of versions of Irish identity and how it changes. You lived in so many countries in different situations. How did your sense of Irishness change by location and over the years?
I guess it changed in terms of it actually got stronger. That's one of the reasons when you're away from your culture, you suddenly realize what you're missing. you have this absence. So you miss people who talk like you, who have the same cultural references, same sort of sense of humor and stuff like that. So when you find yourself bereft of that, which I certainly did when I was in France for 4 years, and for that first 2 years I didn't even speak English. So, and then coming to the other side of the world, which literally is as far as you can possibly get from Ireland. If you travel any further, you'd actually get closer to Ireland. But you have that absence, and you try and find that absence, or you try and fill that absence rather by either hanging out with other Irish people, which I certainly did, or becoming more involved in your culture through language, music, or in my case, also through writing.
So we'll explore the writing thing, obviously, in some detail here, but I'm curious about your experience in New Zealand as an Irish person. How culturally engaged are you locally there? Is there kind of Irish groups, etc., or what does that look like?
New Zealand are usually New Zealanders are very, very positive in terms of the Irish connection. We have a good rep here. We also tend to have a good rep with Maori. So because we've both been colonized, and we have that sort of shared experience, you actually have a lot more street cred. You have more street cred than Pākehā, or the sort of white New Zealanders. So it allows you to entry into certain parts of New Zealand culture, which even a lot of New Zealanders don't get to see. Here in Wellington, when I first got here, so I've been here over 20 years now, and I was probably one of the first, the few Irish people here. There was a lot of Irish immigrants that kind of come over in the 60s, and I went to the Wellington Irish Club, and most of the people there were like in their 70s or 80s. It was really, and that you had a huge amount of people came over around the 60s, then nobody until about sort of the 90s. So you had this kind of huge gap of an age gap in between. Since then, of course, with Irish people traveling a lot more, a lot of people go to Australia, and then they do 1 year in Australia, then they come to New Zealand. And New Zealand is a lot more attractive, I think, to Irish people than Australia, because it's a lot more European, or in terms of style. And also the climate, it's a bit more like Ireland, a bit more rain here. And yeah, it feels more comfortable. It's like a comfortable shoe. It'll never be home. Ireland is always going to be home, but it's a good place to live, to raise my kids. And of course, I stay here because of my partner.
Brian, I know that in 2018, Ireland opens its first embassy in New Zealand. A friend of mine, Peter Ryan, was the ambassador. Did you happen to know Peter?
Yeah, I know Peter. He's good crack. He came in here like a cannonball, and yeah, suddenly where you had a sort of a disparate number of kind of Irish groups, we have a language group, and we have lots of music groups and so on and so forth, and he pulled it all together. He achieved a hell of a lot over here. It was quite interesting to sort of see him undercut the English embassy as well too while he was here, in terms of dealings with Europe.
And he would always make it sound like he had nothing to do with it. He was somewhere behind the scenes, but all you guys are the ones who did it.
That's right. So. Yeah, a very, very clever man, and a lot of fun to spend time with.
Yeah, I think his latest posting, I believe, is in Nigeria, but he obviously spent some time in New York, and created quite an impression in New York as well. So that's where John crossed paths with him. But I want to move forward closer to your writing now. You have a company called Irish Imbas, Imbas. That's a strange word. Tell me about it and the company.
Imbas is basically another word. It's the Irish word for knowledge, but it's actually quite a very old word, essentially, with a lot of sort of esoteric kind of associations. Olus is probably the modern term for knowledge or information, but back in the day, people who used Imbas were basically kind of setting themselves apart, or giving themselves airs in terms of their knowledge and so on. So it seemed perfect for me, to be honest, So because a lot of the stuff I do deals with kind of esoteric origins. it just felt like a natural fit. Yeah.
And so when you set up the company, was the intention always to be as a publishing house for your books, or is that a subset of your overall plan?
Basically, the real focus of Irish Imbas is the sort of the imparting of knowledge, cultural knowledge. I started off through books because it was the easiest way to do that, but I've done a few other sort of ways, through other media as well too. At the moment, the focus is on books, but basically it's an educational purpose. But the key thing about cultural education is that you have to do it in a way that's interesting, and you pretty much can't let people know that you're doing it. Otherwise, people enjoy stuff and they learn stuff if they're actually enjoying it. If you give them a textbook, a lot of the time it won't get through. But if you actually mix it up into the sort of a fiction story or a thriller or whatever like that, whether that media be through books or film or computer games, whatever, you can actually impart a hell of a lot more knowledge. And that was one of the big struggles I had, because when I first started looking at all this stuff, I had a position in the Stout Centre in the Victoria University, where I was a writer in residence for a year. That allowed me access to an amount of data, an amount of information on sort of Irish, ancient Irish narratives, which I'd never had before. And to be totally honest, the amount of information there was absolutely overwhelming. What was also overwhelming was the fact that as I was reading it, I did a focus predominantly on sort of the Fionn narratives, and that's a body of work that kind of goes back about 1,000 years. So there's 1,000 years of, obviously writing from the 5th century, records, etc. But there's just narratives. You could spend your whole life analyzing or writing stuff on that. But the really interesting thing was that nobody knew anything about this stuff. We've been collecting this in Ireland for hundreds of years, and nobody's aware of it, and nobody actually understands it apart from the academics, who do a very good job and they do their best to try and get it out there. But it's very difficult to do that if you're coming from an academic angle, where if I come sort of from a fiction or entertainment angle, I can actually get that information across a lot more effectively.
Brian, why is this important for you? Why is that feeling of imparting the knowledge, imparting the cultural knowledge? What is it that makes that so important for you?
I guess it comes back to when I first came across all the information that I obtained through my research. My initial instinct was, why the hell don't I know this? Why has nobody ever told me this? And I think that would be the reaction of most people. A lot of Irish people don't actually have a clear understanding of their own culture, to be honest. People still talk about, fairy forts, and they speak and think with a kind of an English colonization perspective. And when you speak in English, or when you use English concepts, it's a very different way of thinking than if you were thinking in Irish and using Irish concepts. So again, one of the things I try and get across in the books is I introduce these little concepts, which people don't actually know about. But if you introduce them into the story, they learn them, despite their best wishes, perhaps in some cases. Yeah.
Are any of these concepts that you're advancing hidden away in your stories? Are any of these concepts controversial? Are they controversial at all? Are other people?
Not yet, because I keep a lot of it in history. I think in the next year or two, you'll start seeing a bit more controversial stuff. There's this whole industry around mythology, which is probably quite false, to be honest. It's based on something that doesn't actually exist. And it's based on misassumptions. And I guess a lot of the work that I sort of see myself doing in the next year or two is kind of putting that stuff out there.
The way I've always understood mythology, people, and I'm using the term very generically here, was that the Irish myths originated from an oral tradition. The Christian monks then basically wrote down some of these myths putting their own spin on it. And then come the 19th century, with the kind of Celtic revival, the would-be Irish nationalists, primarily Anglo-Irish, decided that they were going to create, revive this mythology. So they put their own spin on it. And as I understand it, what I learned is basically that kind of Lady Gregory late 19th century, early 20th century of Irish mythology. So what are you telling me? How right did she get this stuff, and how off base, or how much has been omitted, or it's. I know this is just a very small subject area,
but it's a big can of worms. Everything you've sort of heard about mythology certainly in the last 50, but probably in the last 100 years, has been based around English speakers explaining another person's culture or another people's culture. Lady Gregory, I don't think she was an Irish speaker. And she herself, it was a big thing at the time. So herself, Yeats, a whole bunch of other writers, none of them Irish speakers, apart from the future president, who was actually an Irish speaker. But a lot of these writers went off and they basically reinterpreted manuscripts that had been translated from Irish into English. And they basically grabbed the ball and ran with it and invented this kind of false set of narratives, which today is what we call mythology. So mythology actually has, quite frankly, not much to do with Ireland, to be honest. Mythology is essentially where one culture takes another culture's cultural belief systems and creates narratives out of them, reduces them to fairy tales, folk tales, that sort of stuff.
So would it be fair to say, am I detecting this right, that you don't like the word mythology when it comes to describing these Irish stories?
No, we're kind of stuck with the word. When I talk with the Irish academics, they know this. And if you look, if they're any good, when they use the word mythology, you'll see two, marks on either side. There isn't another term to use at the moment, and I guess what my work will be over the next few years is trying to come up with a different word, a different terminology. Again, like I said, it's when you're trying to talk about mythology with people, you can't, unless you have a common language, a common terminology, it's impossible to have a sane conversation. So it's a bit like trying to explain chemistry to somebody who doesn't understand what an atom is. And that's kind of where we're at. We're at that situation where we have to come up with a kind of an agreed understanding of what we're actually talking about, because mythology means completely different things to every person you talk to. You have tourism mythology, you have Instagram mythology, you have political mythology, and you often hear sort of Hollywood producers talking about the mythology of their series, which makes absolutely no sense to me. So at its very base, its very most fundamental, mythology is stories that you tell to understand the world around you. And if it's not helping you to understand the world around you, and if it's not personally relevant, then I think you're struggling to use the term mythology in any sort of meaningful sense.
So I noticed you used in your writing the term, I think it was Irish cultural belief systems, or something along those lines is probably your preferred term rather than mythology. It's probably a more accurate reflection. But my question is, and we're kind of, we talked about, how the 19th century Anglo-Irish basically created this version of these belief systems. But can you possibly come to an understanding of this stuff without a deep understanding of the language? I notice you use Irish words quite a lot in your books. So what's your take? What's the best way to kind of teach this stuff?
No, you're absolutely right. So basically, you can't discuss Irish mythology. And again, I have to use that term. I really dislike using that term, but there isn't any other one. You can't discuss Irish mythology unless you have a grounding in the Irish language, because language carries cultural ways of thinking. So you can translate, but there's no such thing as an exact translation. So when you're translating something from one language into another, you're basically, sometimes the concept that exists in one language doesn't exist in the other. So you need a hell of a lot more words to actually explain one word in one language. So if I take the example of something like in French, for example, there's the expression "elle me fait le lapin," "elle me pose un lapin." So she literally she gave me a rabbit, which basically means she stood me up. So if you tried to translate that, I mean, you're translating a concept which literally is nonsense in another language, and it's exactly the same when you translate concepts from Gaelic into English. It's a bit like Schrodinger's cat. You're completely changing it, and and that's why a lot of what you sort of see in terms of when people sort of claim Irish mythology or Celtic mythology, if it's an English program, they're probably starting on a negative. You're probably starting from a no-go area.
Brian, I think from the conversation so far, the listener may not have a really great sense of what your novels are all about yet. We've been having kind of an academic discussion, but these are not academic books. They're full of action, adventure, blood, passion. And could you just give us a view of one of your series and sort of take us to the world that you're describing and maybe pick out a key character that you love in some way and tell us about that character's world?
Sure. I guess of the series that I'm doing at the moment, probably the most popular at the moment is definitely the Liath Luachra series, which is an Irish woman warrior series. It's about a character who I based on a single line reference from the Fionn narratives. So basically, I created this character linked to Fionn and I had originally started a series called Fionn, which I'm still writing. But I did a kind of a prequel with this particular character called Liath Luachra. And in the books, she's basically sort of a woman warrior who's got a very sort of traumatized past. And the whole series is about her adventures, but also how she kind of grows into a kind of a human being over the course of those books. I think there's probably 5 books out now in the Liath Luachra series. And so the character grows something, there's some development aspect all the way through, even though each sort of book has its own kind of particular adventure plot. I wanted to sort of go down that route because I wanted to explore the whole world of the Fianna. So a lot of people, even to this day, still think that there was only ever one sort of Fionn, and the Fianna was Fionn McCool, and that was it. So again, this is a concept that I've introduced in the books, for example, where you have each Fionn is basically usually tribally based. It's a bunch of people who come together for some sort of action, whether it be sort of killing a local wolf or attacking another sort of tribal entity. But I decided to sort of modernize that by making this particular Fionn that this Liath Luachra is with as a kind of a bunch of mercenaries in a sense, which is complete fiction because it would never have happened. But it was a way just to sort of examine the tribal interactions and the sort of the Fionn interactions as they would have worked back in the day.
And talk to us a bit about, I think you say in your books that this is meant to happen in the late 2nd century of Ireland, is where you're kind of putting it in a traditional timeline. Iron Age Ireland or prehistoric Ireland. And I find those notions themselves to be kind of a little interesting, like the notion of prehistory, right? Because I think the people of Ireland at the time didn't consider themselves to be prehistoric. I think they probably considered themselves to have quite a deep culture. But tell me about, how do you go about immersing yourself in a world that is no longer existent?
Basically, I have to start with the history that does exist. So a lot of the history that we use for prehistory, and I should perhaps explain that prehistory in Ireland is the period before the 5th century when writing first came to the country via the church, and records actually started existing. A lot of the writing that happened from the 5th century onward referred to events prior to that. So you can actually extrapolate. You can also extrapolate by looking at other cultures that had other countries that had similar cultures. And in those kind of prehistoric periods, a lot of the social dynamics were very, very similar. They weren't as complex as societies are today. So you can look at other culture, you can look at countries in Europe, but you can also look at other cultures in much far-flung areas, and you can still get a pattern that would have been reproduced in Ireland. So, for example, here in New Zealand, a lot of my thinking around the sort of tribal dynamics is from watching the tribal dynamics here in New Zealand, and they would have played out exactly the same back in Ireland. I said a lot of this stuff, as I said, and I started off by saying it in the sort of the 2nd century, but then, like you say, it doesn't really make any difference because there are no records. All you have is kind of a fluctuating baseline in terms of time. So my first Fionn book was sort of early 2nd century. I've since gone back to the 1st century, so I've actually changed my time period because I just felt it suited better. And also because a lot of it is based in Ireland, you can pretty much, you've got a lot of leeway in terms of what you can actually play with, as long as you align with the history, the architectural history in terms of standing stones and all that as well.
Yeah, and standing stones, do crop up quite a bit in your books. And I think it's kind of fascinating because you can see the characters themselves going, I don't know what this is. This is done by the ancient ones, right? And you're like, well, ain't you ancient? I'm reading this book. You're meant to be 2,000 years ago. But guess what? If you came across Newgrange at that time, that would have been pretty old at that point in time. So it gives you a sense of the scale.
That's right, yeah. I mean, Newgrange is, 2,000 years? And the time that they say sort of the Celts came across to Ireland, it was already ancient at that stage. So the belief at the moment in academic circles is that when people came from sort of the continent and moved to Ireland, they would have found these huge structures, and they would have been venerated because they were, even today, they're still pretty damn impressive. But, they would not have fully, understood where they came from. They would have had religious connotations, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I felt also that the landscape was a character often, and it's a landscape that it probably is very, very different in many areas from the landscape of today in Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing for me is that when people talk about ancient Ireland, they're usually sort of sitting in an armchair in an air-conditioned building. So, a lot of what people say or think about ancient Ireland is very much based on the premise of our own existence. So it's very hard for us to think as an Iron Age person would think. So a big challenge for me is trying to get into the headset of people back at that period. So basically, the way I do that is by keeping the physical stuff as real as I possibly can, and also by thinking a lot of the English that I use is actually kind of based on Irish structure and so on. So people have emotions on them. They're never happy. They have happiness on them, etc. And that kind of gives it a bit of authenticity that it probably would otherwise lack, I think.
Yeah, I've done some reading about forestry lately in Ireland, and one of the things you refer to is the Great Wild in the book, in a number of the books. As I understand it, Ireland would have been pretty darn heavily forested right around the time that you speak. Now, the Neolithic peoples, the peoples that built Newgrange, they were the first guys to start actually clearing forest. But I think by the time of, when you're setting your Fionn McCool, Liath Luachra series, the country had probably about 70 or 80% forested. And when you compare it to the current Ireland, the one that's featured in all the tourist maps with lovely fields and hedgerows, etc., this is a totally, totally different place. And that really comes across in your books. And, how do you imagine that? Or, what helps you kind of in imagining that?
Again, I guess I start off using the basis of what's known in terms of history and archaeology. So Ireland at the time, people are the specialists believe that there was probably no more than 100,000 people in the entire country at that time. Most of them would have been based in family groups or sort of tribal systems. They would have been very, very close, completely dependent on each other. And whenever people moved into the wilderness, it was a big thing because you had this nature was absolutely huge. And if you actually went into the forest, a lot of the time there was a risk you probably wouldn't come back. It was heavily infested with wolves. And the trying to get through forest back in the day, this was really dense forest that had been growing for centuries, probably even longer. And the undergrowth would have been completely clogged. People were very much dependent on certain paths because the vast majority of the country just would have been impassable. So people would tend to follow the same paths all the time. So when you bring all that in, it creates restrictions on your story, and you have to work within that for it to actually work in a sort of a genuine manner.
So just switching back to Liath Luachra, because she seems to travel around quite a bit. It's an interesting character because you kind of have her moving through the country and you kind of encounter these, various experiences. Like I read the second book in the series, which has to do a lot with wolves and relationship with a part of the country that we, I guess, fairly recently called Ossory, but it'd be around Kilkenny or whatever. But just backing to this particular character, Liath Luachra, you mentioned the fact that you kind of started writing her story based on one line in the Fionn McCool legendary cycle, and it took off in terms of demand. Why do you think that was?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I honestly, to today, I'm not really completely sure why. I guess she was certainly the favorite character in the initial book, the initial Fionn book. So when I did do a sequel or a prequel, actually, it was just meant to be a sort of a story kind of introducing her. It was a lot darker. I don't know what was going through my head at the time, but the book was a lot darker, and the character was a lot darker. But I guess I was also dealing with the fact that she was a woman and trying to exist in a very physical time, very brutal time, where she was pretty much at the mercy of some dubious characters, and the things that she had to do to survive, I guess in some cases were quite ingenious, in other cases were just very, very savage. So she's quite a complex character in that respect, in that she has to use her wits, but also her kind of her natural skills to survive. And I think potentially that's probably what attracted people to her. She's incredibly intense. She became such a strong character when I was actually writing it that she started dominating the story, because originally the first Fionn was supposed to go in one direction, but she actually came along and changed the direction completely.
Yeah, she seems at times like almost feral.
Yeah. Oh, she is completely feral. That was the whole point, because she's essentially kind of not so much brought up with wolves, but spends so much time in the wilderness that she becomes kind of absorbed into it. And feral is probably a good description of her. She then has to engage with other people, of course, which creates quite a lot of the friction, quite a lot of the sort of the tension, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. But yeah, she is a lot of fun to write. I have to admit, she's probably my favorite character.
And can you tell me a little bit about the readership? Is there like a demand maybe for a strong warrior woman type figure that's driven by female readership, or do you have any sense of that at all?
A lot of my stuff kind of gets lumped in with fantasy genre, which I've become increasingly uncomfortable with over the last few years. That's not because I dislike fantasy. It's just what I do for me is very much culturally based. It's not fantasy. I would call it fiction. No problems calling it fiction, but it's not fantasy really. But there, within the fantasy genre, you're certainly seeing a lot more of what they call kick-ass heroines, and there's been really a push along that line for the last few years. I think it's because you have a much higher female readership in some cases, particularly in fantasy. But and this is what people want to read. I wasn't really influenced by any of that. I just was sort of pulled along by the character in some respects. But yeah, that there definitely is a market for that. I think it probably is on the decline now, but if you have an interesting character at the end of the day, that'll keep people coming back.
Brian, is the phenomena of cosplay popular in New Zealand, where people dress up as the characters? And have you seen your characters in a cosplay?
I haven't seen my character in a cosplay. There is some cosplay here, but I'm not really I'm not really familiar with that grouping here. I have gone to one or two sort of conferences and so on where there is cosplay, but it's not really something I'm into myself. I guess what's interesting with the Liath Luachra character is that when I first wrote her about I don't know, would have been 7 or 8 years ago now, maybe. Um, there was no reference to her anywhere. If you looked online, there wasn't a thing. You wouldn't find a thing on Liath Luachra apart from maybe in a dictionary saying, this was a character. Blah 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 blah. The popularity of the character was such that you now look online and people are quoting verbatim about this. She was the first sort of female warrior, as if it's fact. It's quite funny to read this and you're thinking, they don't seem to have cottoned on that this is actually I made this stuff up. And there's all these authorities out there declaring how Liath Luachra was the first sort of female warrior. You have a lot of people sort of saying she was the first example of a bisexual warrior, and again, this is all fiction. It amuses me immensely when I sort of see this stuff turning up, and most of it, unfortunately, is sort of based on what I've written, and which has been completely taken out of context.
Brian, you mentioned being at a convention or a conference, and that's the first thing I've heard that sounded in the category of business, your publishing business. How is it that you get the word out? What's your business model, and letting people know about these books, purchase these books, and become part of your audience?
My business model is something of a flexible one. Because I've been raising kids and so on for the last few years, I've really just been doing sort of the Irish Imbas work. It's probably just been 0.5% of my time for the last 7 or 8 years. I've been able to produce maybe a book, sometimes a book and a half per year, and slowly, increasing the portfolio. Also doing quite a lot of work in terms of my own research around cultural belief systems and stuff like that. It's only in the last sort of 6 months that I've really started working a bit more full time on this. I still do, a lot of freelance strategic conceptual design kind of work as well too. So it's really kind of just I haven't really been marketing particularly highly, but it's kind of spread more by word of mouth. But now it does seem to be growing at an exponential rate at this stage. Certainly sales are starting to increase quite dramatically. And yeah, I guess I have a bit more presence. I should probably mention as well too that at one stage the Liath Luachra series was going to be made into a television series. It was picked up by Michael Grace of Graceland. He was the guy who wrote or co-wrote the Poltergeist and various other movies like that. So that was all kind of ready to go. It was actually kind of, I was flying over to Ireland to catch up with the producers and so on. And just before it kind of went into motion, COVID hit. And literally about 2 weeks before we were supposed to meet in Ireland, New Zealand was locked down. I couldn't fly. And, for safety reasons, we didn't want to fly anyway, to be honest. And unfortunately, the series never went ahead. But that was an interesting experience. I've since had one or two other people looking at the options, but I just haven't had time really to focus on pushing that side of the business.
So are you free now to basically shop the series around again, or how does that work?
I'm starting to. So I sent some material on Liath Luachra and the Beara Trilogy to an Irish production company because Ireland's booming at the moment in terms of screen stuff. But I just do not have the time to follow it up. I'm incredibly time poor. So between producing various projects, so I have a lot of books to write, but I also have a whole bunch of stuff in terms of educational material, which I'm producing over the next year, and which I'm hoping to release as well. And conceptual stuff, like the Irish conceptual model and all this sort of stuff. A whole bunch of what I find interesting, which I want to achieve.
Just wanted to ask, you kind of talked about the fact that your books are getting lumped in with fantasy, and you're bringing more rigor to this because you're trying to transmit a certain understanding of this Ireland, from 1800, 1900 years ago. What are things, a couple of things, if you're going to impart on people that you think every Irish person should know about that time now? And we use Irish in a big church sense. In other words, not just the Irish of Ireland, but, the Irish globally. You would like people to walk away with and say, okay, I'm going to stick my freaking spear in the ground and say, you need to know this.
Where do I start? Need a big stick. Oh,
Brian's top 10.
I think it's a javelin.
Yeah. God, I don't know where to start. I guess that the key thing for me is really sort of just trying to get across to people that what you think is, Irish mythology is not, and you need to be able to discern the difference between one and the other. If you want to understand Ireland, you really have to understand Gaelic culture. You really have to have some knowledge of the language. Otherwise, you're really just somebody who comes along with a T-shirt, sort of saying, "Kiss me, I'm Irish," which might work on St. Paddy's Day, but it does not give you any credibility. Yeah, those are probably the sort of the two main things. I guess one reason I sort of did sort of the genre that I did as well too is that I had been hitting quite a lot of what's known as Celtic fantasy, which is basically just fantasy with sort of Irish branding on it, as far as I can tell. There's no real kind of sometimes they'll put in an Irish name or something like that. I saw a classic recently where somebody was saying somebody had the sight, so they were saying, he had the Ryark, and Ryark is the Irish for, it's not sight, it's actually view, it's something you see from a distance. They used the wrong term, of course, because they obviously got it from, Google Translate, whatever. So, a lot of what I do is kind of to sort of counter a lot of that sort of misrepresentation through Celtic fantasy and other routes. Amazon's another target.
I even understand to some degree that the word Celt or Celtic is somewhat controversial. I think of, let's say, for example, some of the things that people automatically assume are Celtic symbols. The famous stone in front of Newgrange, for example, that's a Celtic symbol. No, because it's Neolithic. It vastly predates the arrival of
right.
Celts. And I even think the term Celt is like really, poorly understood.
Yeah. I guess there's certain words. Celt is a bit like mythology. It's a word that is made up and means different things to different people. I never use the word mythology anymore. I never use the word Celtic anymore if I possibly can get away with it. I think it's useful in terms of if you're describing the Celtic countries. That's the only time I would ever use the word Celt or Celt. You have all these people, and I meet a lot of people, and they're all sort of telling me that they're Celts, and I'm like, for me, it's as soon as you say you're a Celt, it's like you have no connection whatsoever with your own heritage. Are you an Irish Celt, or are you a Welsh Celt, or what exactly are you saying here? It's a bit like saying I'm a European, but somebody coming from Germany is completely different to somebody coming from Italy, et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't mean anything if you go around telling people you're Celtic.
Brian, a little while ago, you mentioned that you were time poor. And we do not want to add to your time poverty by keeping you on this transoceanic call much longer, but we would like to know what your Seamus plug is.
I guess for the shameless plug, I'll plug two things. One, I'll plug the Liath Luachra series. If you are interested in sort of adventure stories, for want of a better term, with a kind of an authentic Irish basis, then that's certainly one to look for. Another thing I will plug is that it's something a project that I'm working on, which I'm hoping to bring out next year, which is basically a kind of trying to teach people what mythology is, and what it isn't, and how it can be, personally relevant or not. That's kind of an educational project I'm hoping to bring out next year, so maybe keep an eye out on that. Also, you can get latest updates from my newsletter, which comes out. It's called Vogue, V-O-G, not V-O-G-U-E. And that comes out at the end of every month. You can get that on Irish Imbas Substack. And that's kind of where I'll do my most important announcements over the next wee while.
So we'll be sure to include links to your website, and so people can track down your work.
All right, thank you.
So just wanted to say thank you so much on behalf of both myself and John and our listeners to give an understanding of the work you do, how it is bringing a different, more historically accurate or more historically accurate version of Irish culture to the fore. I think this is valuable work. I know I certainly have been entertained and reading a little bit more in this particular space as a result of reading your books. I'm looking forward, as time permits, to taking in a few more. So thank you so much.
Thank
you, Brian.
Thank you both very much.
Well, we really went global that time, Martin. It was great to be able to add a little New Zealand flavor to Irish stew and expand our global Irish nation even a little bit further. I found Brian a tough guy to characterize, given his aversion to labels like mythology, Celtic, and fantasy. What do you think, Martin?
Yeah, I think Brian, as he said at one point in the course of the podcast, was his work is devoted to revealing ancient Irish cultural beliefs. And I think that's how he likes to view his work. And I've read a number of these books, the Liath Luachra series and the Fionn series, and I think it's a great introduction to what is, to some degree, an unknown Ireland, but it is beautifully realized. And if you want to transport yourself to a totally different dimension through time, I think it's time well spent reading Brian O'Sullivan's novels. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cumhaill O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.